From Chicago studios, this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Samana Siddiqui. Our top story tonight is about a new pact to counter China. The United States announced a new alliance Wednesday with Australia and Britain to strengthen naval capabilities in the Indo-Pacific. The move is a response to America's growing rivalry with China. As a result, Australia will get a new American-made nuclear submarine fleet.
Today, we're taking another historic step to deepen and formalize cooperation among all three of our nations, because we all recognize the imperative of ensuring peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific over the long term.
President Biden said enabling Australia to build nuclear-powered submarines would ensure that they had the most modern capabilities we need to maneuver and defend against rapidly evolving threats. But not everyone is happy about the initiative. China, New Zealand, France, and the environmental organization Greenpeace reacted negatively to the news. Beijing on Thursday slammed the new U.S. alliance as an extremely irresponsible threat to regional stability. Here's Chinese Foreign Minister Zhou Lijian.
有关国家应摒弃陈旧的冷战零和思维和狭隘的地缘政治观念，尊重地区国家民心，多做有利于地区和平稳定发展的事，否则只会搬起石头砸自己的脚。
New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern said the country will not lift a ban on Australia's nuclear subs.
We have an independent foreign policy. We'll take our own view on foreign policy issues. We'll continue to make a contribution, but our lens is very much peace, stability, and a rules-based order. That'll always be the case.
French Defense Minister Florence Parly said that the alliance is a huge disappointment. This was because Australia scrapped a potential $36 billion submarine deal with France as a result of the pact. President Joe Biden says he has great confidence in General Mark Milley, the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff. A book by Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Robert Costa said Milley called his Chinese counterpart toward the end of Donald Trump's presidential term. This was to assure him about the stability of the United States.
Sir, did General Milley do the right thing, sir?
Thank you.
In your opinion, did General Milley do the right thing?
I have great confidence in General Milley.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Biden pushed back against Republican calls to fire Milley. This is for allegedly undermining civilian control of the military in the calls last October and January. The United Nations top human rights official on Wednesday called for a moratorium on the sale and use of artificial intelligence systems. Michelle Bachelet is the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. She said that AI technologies can have negative, even catastrophic effects if they are used without sufficient regard to how they affect people's human rights. Bachelet's remarks came at a Council of Europe hearing on the Pegasus scandal. That involved the use of an Israeli military-connected firm's spyware. The Pegasus software was used to target human rights activists, journalists, and opposition politicians worldwide by authoritarian regimes, including India. In related news, Apple on Monday released plugs to a hole in its iMessage software. This flaw allowed the Pegasus software to infiltrate phones without users clicking on any links. Researchers from the University of Toronto's Citizen Lab discovered the problem. It was exploited by the notorious Israeli software company to spy on human rights activists, journalists, and opposition leaders. As life limps back to normalcy in Afghanistan's capital, Kabul, low-income Afghans are selling their household items to survive. After the fall of the Afghan government on August 15th, the resulting two-week closure of banks created a cash shortage. This led Afghans facing increasing poverty being forced to sell their carpets, sofa sets, kitchenware, television sets, sewing machines, as well as beds for cash. In a report published last week, the UN warned that more than 97% of Afghanistan's population could fall below the poverty line by mid-2022. Here is a report by Saleha Farouk about what people in Kabul are facing.
It has been 1 month since U.S. soldiers left Afghanistan and the Taliban had taken over the country. Kabul airport is functional again. There is finally an interim government, and the United Nations has raised $1.1 billion to help Afghans. But how are Afghans doing now? The AFP asked this question in Kabul. We shared this with you in translation. This 40-year-old woman is a teacher. She is speaking in Dari language. Our future is uncertain. Now we have no salary, no income, no work, nothing. Everyone is very worried about the future. Right now, people have no food and many are trying to feed their families by selling their appliances. Mohammad Shahram is a 17-year-old high school student speaking in Dari language. We want the Islamic Emirate to reopen our schools. I am 17, but our schools are still closed. I want them to reopen the schools as soon as possible. Lal Agha is a 32-year-old grape seller. He had to change his business to adjust to new realities. I used to sell flowers. When most of the rich people had left the country, there were not enough customers to buy flowers, so I started this fruit stall selling grapes. I'm satisfied with it. It provides for the family's expenses. I'm grateful to God, and I'm really satisfied with my new business. In the past, before the arrival of the Taliban, the situation was bad. Policemen would come and slash the tires of my stall and beat us and make us ashamed. But now no one bothers us or causes trouble. Here is Mohammad Ashraf. He is 36 years old but has no job. Today, the security situation is better than in the past. In previous governments, there was corruption and now there is none, but there is no work either. The security situation is good. This 19-year-old journalism student has been waiting in front of a bank. The situation is good. There are no security problems, but the economy is in decline. It's not going well. Fellow citizens have come here to the bank to get their money back. They've been waiting here for days. So here you have it. They are thankful for security, but most of them are worried. While we pray for the peace and well-being of Afghan people, they have suffered in the last 43 years of war. May God give them sabr, patience, and endurance, and may God open the hearts of their neighbors towards them.
20 years ago, U.S. Representative Barbara Lee was the only member of Congress to vote against war in the immediate aftermath of the devastating 9/11 attacks. In a dramatic address on the House floor, she urged her colleagues, "Let us not become the evil that we deplore." But the final vote in the House was 420-1, with Lee the only one opposing war. Speaking with Democracy Now!'s Amy Goodman last week, Lee said the vote was just a total abdication of our responsibilities as members of Congress. She called for Congress to investigate the war in Afghanistan. The sole survivor of the ISIS cell that killed 130 people in Paris 6 years ago claimed France knew the risks of attacking ISIS targets in Syria. Salah Abdeslam, in the second week of the court proceedings, said yesterday, "We attacked France, targeted its population, civilians, but there was nothing personal." Abdeslam was one of 10 people who attacked Paris on the night of November 13, 2015, using suicide bombings and mass shootings. Here is Manu Sahabi, whose son Khairuddin Sahabi was killed in the attack.
C'est des personnes, c'est des gens qui sont là, qui ont été touchés, et il est arrivé à détruire la vie des gens, voilà, et détruire même des familles. Voilà ce que je pense de ça. Mais pour dire que bon, je me suis attaqué à la France, c'est un moyen de fuir ses responsabilités, c'est tout.
The Minnesota Supreme Court has reversed former police officer Mohammad Noor's third-degree murder conviction. The 33-year-old Somali American was convicted on charges of third-degree murder and manslaughter in the 2017 death of Justine Rushdig Damond. The reversal will mean that his 12-year prison sentence will likely be reduced by 8 years. But it leaves intact the second-degree manslaughter verdict by the jury against Noor. Quoting a verse from the Quran, "With hardship comes ease," the former Minneapolis police officer said he is looking forward to hugging his son as soon as possible. Noor's legal team said they are grateful for an exceptionally well-reasoned and unanimous opinion from the state's highest court. Noor had testified that he feared for his partner's life as Damond approached their squad car in the dark, empty alley on the night of July 15, 2017. But Hennepin County prosecutors said Noor overreacted and failed to properly assess the situation before firing a gunshot into her abdomen. Until the reversal, Noor was the first former officer in Minnesota to be convicted of murder for an on-duty killing. Derek Chauvin, who was found guilty this year for murdering George Floyd, is the only other officer in Minnesota to be convicted of murder. Today is Yom Kippur, the most important day in the Jewish calendar. It is a day of atonement when Jews seek to expiate their sins and achieve reconciliation with God. Ultra-Orthodox Jewish men and children perform the Tashlich ritual in the coastal city of Netanya.
לפני יום כיפור יש עניין של תשליך. עושים תשליך וזורקים את העבירות לדגים, לים, להתנקות.
Four top U.S. gymnasts, including Olympic champion Simone Biles, excoriated USA Gymnastics, the U.S. Olympic Committee, and the FBI. This was for failing to take immediate action over sexual abuse allegations against team doctor Larry Nassar. They made the statements during powerful Senate testimony. "We have been failed and we deserve answers," the 24-year-old Biles said. Biles is a 7-time Olympic medalist and the most decorated gymnast in World Championship history.
I sit before you today to raise my voice so that no little girl must endure what I, the athletes at this table, and the countless others who needlessly suffered under Nassar's guise of medical treatment, which we continue to endure today. We suffered and continue to suffer because no one at FBI, USAG, or the USOPC did what was necessary to protect us. We have been failed, and we deserve answers.
Nassar is serving a life sentence after pleading guilty to sexually assaulting women and girls while working as a sports medicine doctor at USA Gymnastics and Michigan State University. Sexual assaults are the most prevalent crimes in the United States, but they are also the most underreported. Teens between the ages of 14 and 17 are by far the most likely to be sexually victimized. A SpaceX rocket carrying 4 space tourists blasted off Wednesday night from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. This was for the first mission to orbit the globe with an all-civilian crew. A few have gone before and many are about to follow, said Jared Isaacman, the 38-year-old billionaire who chartered the flight. The spaceship's trajectory will take it to an altitude of 357 miles, which is deeper into space than the International Space Station. After spending 3 days spinning around the planet, the 4-person crew will splash down off the Florida coast. Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment, so stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Welcome back. In one of our previous analysis segments, we discussed the issue of Rohingya education. Let's watch.
Thank you very much. Today, we're very happy to be joined by Adem Carroll, who is Director of United Nations Program at the Special Burma Task Force campaign. Thank you so much, Adem, for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Now, you recently authored a report entitled Let the Rohingya Learn. This publication was put out on the heels of a statement by Cox's Bazar CSO NGO, which reported that a lack of formal education for children and youth was being faced by the Rohingya communities today, and for a long time, of course. Tell us about these gaps in education for these refugee children and youth.
Yeah, thank you for your attention. This is really a very serious crisis, the lack of access to education. Rohingya community members have been bringing this up as a priority and asking us to get more involved. So we have done some research, issued this report, and indeed, not only have Rohingya been systematically denied access to education in their homeland, in Rakhine State, Burma, but now as refugees in Bangladesh, about 600,000 children have really very limited educational opportunities. The government there has limited them because their idea is that the migrants need to go home, even though that's not likely anytime soon. And so they were worried about providing more services. Services have been largely, limited to food and shelter. And the education that has been allowed in the Cox's Bazar camps have been the early grades, and they have not even been allowed to call them schools. They're called learning centers. And the international NGOs have very limited kind of socialization, basic skills for the youngest children. And there is no certification, there is no high school or pathway to higher education. Those doors are locked. And this is why we think a special pressure on the Bangladesh government is needed to change those policies.
Thank you. Now, experts are saying that these barriers to schooling for Rohingya refugees is not necessarily due to limited resources, but from Bangladeshi policies, as you mentioned, that deliberately deprive Rohingya children from education for the purpose of preventing their reintegration into society. This is a very interesting fact that was released recently. If you could tell us about the long-term implications of such a practice from the Bangladeshi government.
Yes. Really, it's an extension of genocidal policy. When we see in Burma that the government there refused access to Rohingya children for 2 generations, what does that do to a people? And then once these traumatized people have fled into Bangladesh, which has taken them on, then to deny their children a future by restricting education, it's really a shocking thing. We should say, however, that a number of host countries do something similar. They deny refugees, and specifically the Rohingya, refugee status legally. They just say, oh, these people aren't refugees, they're migrants. And doing so, they then restrict education. Certainly many countries, and we deal with this in the report a bit, Malaysia, for example, which has many Rohingya refugees there. It does limit access in public schools. India limits access in public schools. The policy is to keep Rohingya isolated from the general population. And we certainly see that in Bangladesh again, this policy of isolation and restriction. They are afraid the Rohingya will stay, and they're not seeing the Rohingya as a potential resource. Just as in the United States, there are some groups that don't see immigrants as resources, and they don't want to invest in them. They see them only as threats. This is a wrong way to think. However, we, Burma Task Force, with our allies, support eventual repatriation. And I understand that the Rohingya would prefer to go back to their homeland. But it is not safe, and they don't have rights. And with the current coup and the current unrest and the conflict in Rakhine State, we're not going to see repatriation anytime soon. So let's invest in education.
Focusing in on one of the major findings from the report that you recently published, if you could tell us about how the rights restrictions and exclusions that resulted from Burma's 1982 citizenship laws might have led to Rohingya children being illiterate to begin with, and how that legacy has continued on well after their fleeing of Burma.
Right. Well, Burmese government statistics show that Rakhine State has an overall fairly high literacy rate, 84.7%, I think, and yet the literacy rate among Rohingya children there before the mass displacement was really low. I mean, 80% were not literate. And so the lack of access to schools was partly because after 2012, the policy shifted to prevent freedom of movement to Rohingya in the Rakhine State area. And without freedom of movement, they couldn't go from village to village to their little schools. And Rohingya were also sometimes just banned from the schools, but other times Rakhine Buddhist teachers just didn't want to teach them. There was a whole range of exclusions that impacted access, and that went all the way up to Siddiqui University, which originally had Rohingya students, but then they banned Rohingya students. So it's systematic, and in the name of national security, of course, it was done that way, and prolonged. So this kind of terrible targeting of children just went along with the general genocidal policies to disenfranchise Rohingya people. And of course, that led to the mass atrocities. So the Rohingya who remain in Rakhine State, relatively little is known of their conditions because they are kind of locked up in an open air prison. Very few international observers have been allowed in, and they don't say a lot because they're afraid of losing that very slight access. So we have to assume that they don't have access to education now, except, and I should put one exception here that is important, the Rohingya themselves have been very resilient. And the report finds that volunteer teachers have been trying to teach their own community during this whole period of oppression in Rakhine State, in Burma. Quietly, secretly even. Some of them are madrasas, some of them are regular schools, but they've been trying to teach the Rohingya children. And now, as those teachers were displaced into Bangladesh, for example, they are continuing this very quiet education, but it is limited. It is very limited. And unfortunately, with the Bangladesh government not permitting international NGOs to support these grassroots efforts, there is a disconnect. To really support these community-run educational efforts in the refugee camps in Bangladesh, there needs to be certification. There needs to be an overall system. And there are some kind of foundation for that in the madrasa system, but it needs a lot more support. And it needs acceptance by the government instead of banning internet access or banning phone service. Much of the pandemic last year, there was none no internet service in the Bangladesh camps. And so that meant that there could be no distance learning. It really one layer upon another of exclusion.
Adem, thank you for your important time today.
Thanks.
Before moving on to our next analysis, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back after these messages.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
I am what hunger looks like in America. I am an 8-year-old girl who's not excited for the last day of school. Because this may be the last time I'll have lunch. Till September. I am a single father of 2 who works 3 part-time jobs, and that's still not enough to put food on the table. I was created by artificial intelligence from faces of the 1 in 8 Americans who struggle with hunger.
Feeding America, 200 food banks strong.
Dad, they took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3.
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. On Muslim News, we covered the news of U.S. Acting Ambassador Atul Keshav's meeting with the RSS chief. To discuss this in detail, let's go to Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Samana. U.S. Ambassador Atul Keshav is a temporary ambassador to India. He's Indian American. He has met the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, RSS that is, its chief, Bhagwat. That's a serious issue, but it seems to have not created any noise in America. It's like American ambassador in Germany meeting Hitler before he came into power. But in this case, RSS is the power in India. They are behind a whole lot of lynching and oppression of minorities. But American ambassador just goes and meet with them without creating much news in America, although India is talking about. He is real power because the Prime Minister and the President of India are members of RSS, have been involved in killing Muslims and other minorities before. RSS chief, Mohan Bhagwat, is provided the highest level of security in India. What's going on here? To discuss all of this with us is someone who keeps an eye. He's a human rights activist, Pieter Friedrich. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Hi, Malik. Thank you for having me.
Tell us what's going on in India nowadays.
Well, there's almost too much to tell. The situation in India, especially since the Modi regime came into power and got back into power for the past 7 years, but particularly for the past 2 to 3 years, has significantly deteriorated. You might be able to say that there's no longer any pretense of even recognizing or protecting human rights. Civil liberties have been virtually stripped away at this point, if not in law, certainly in practice. Activists, academics, social workers around the country, from the majority population, many of them, have been framed and arrested in false conspiracy cases. Muslims are being lynched across the country for things such as being accused, falsely or otherwise, of transporting or possessing beef, or even in the latest spate of cases, simply for working while being Muslim. Alternative media outlets around the country have been repeatedly raided by various bureaucratic departments in order to harass and intimidate them. And we've just seen, and we're continuing to see, rather faster than normal, particularly over these past couple of years, this progression under the Modi regime towards a Hindu Rashtra or a Hindu agenda, where various steps, various major key points of the platform to create a Hindu Rashtra have emerged over the past couple of years with the annexation of Kashmir, the verdict on the Babri Masjid destruction of 1992, the approval of the courts to proceed with building a temple over the ruins of that mosque, which was destroyed, that masjid, which was destroyed by a RSS-led mob, of the Citizenship Amendment Act and the related National Register of Citizens, which essentially premises Indian citizenship on religious basis, of anti-conversion laws, of so-called love jihad laws, which are designed to prevent interfaith marriages, particularly marriages of Hindus and Muslims, and so on and so forth. It's a very sorry situation.
So this RSS chief, an American ambassador meeting, do you think American ambassador was not aware of who he is meeting?
Well, that's absolutely impossible. Certainly, Ambassador Atul Kashyap, who met with RSS Chief Mohan Bhagwat on September 8th, must have known who he was meeting. Certainly, any diplomat of that level would be fully briefed and informed about the people with whom he or her are meeting before the meeting. On top of that, Kashyap is a career lifelong diplomat in the U.S. State Department. He's also of Indian origin. He certainly, as anybody of Indian origin who follows Indian politics remotely today, which as the acting ambassador to India at the time, he certainly would be expected to be following Indian politics. Anyone in that position would absolutely know what the RSS is.
So let's talk a little bit what RSS is. Acting ambassador probably knows pretty well, must have a lot of memos about it.
I would say certainly knows, not probably.
So for our audience who may not have any idea what RSS is, could you please define and explain a little bit?
Yes, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, or RSS, is the parent organization of a family of organizations called the Sangh Parivar. It's the mother organization. It is a paramilitary with about 6 million members and multiple subsidiaries, which have millions of their own members. It's the fountainhead of Hindutva, or Hindu nationalism, this religious nationalist political ideology, which treats non-Hindus in India as foreigners and which seeks to turn India into a theocratic Hindu nation. It was founded in 1925, around the same time that the European fascist movements in Europe were developing, and it has direct connections, both ideologically as well as in actual practice at the time, to those European fascist movements led by people like Mussolini and Hitler. Its founders at the time in the 1930s, 1940s, as the Nazis were sweeping across Europe with the assistance of the fascists in Italy, the founders of the RSS pointed to the Nazis, pointed to those fascists in Europe, and identified their ideology as one that they wanted to mimic and imitate and spread in India. They also even actually visited Europe and met with Mussolini, toured his fascist groups there, and then returned to India and pointed to the RSS and said that they wanted the RSS to be exactly like those fascist groups that they saw under Mussolini in Italy. Furthermore, they notoriously called out the purging of the Jews conducted by Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, or the actions leading up to the full Holocaust. They pointed that out as what they saw as a good lesson to learn and profit by and to imitate. Now, who did they want to imitate it with? In the case of the Nazis were targeting primarily Jewish people. In the case of the RSS, they primarily target Muslims and Christians. They view Muslims and Christians as members of foreign races, as an internal threat, or in so many words, as traitors. And over the years since the RSS was founded in 1925, it has carried forth that ideology, put it into practice with over a dozen pogroms against Muslims and Christians, terrorist bombings, lynchings, assassinations, etc. And today, where we see the RSS is we see the RSS in power. It is the power behind the throne being Modi and his BJP regime. The BJP is essentially the political wing of the RSS. It was founded by the RSS. The vast majority of cabinet ministers in Modi's cabinet are members of the RSS. Of course, Modi himself, the prime minister, the president, as you mentioned, the home minister of the country, Ahmad Shah, all of the most powerful people in the country are RSS members. And the BJP openly and unashamedly, repeatedly throughout the 7 years of the Modi regime, holds these summits, these meetings with the RSS to consult on policy, to consult on its agenda going forward, and to essentially, one might argue, take orders from the RSS.
So the American ambassador, when he decided to meet the RSS chief, don't you think some might consider it's a legitimate issue because he is the real power?
Well, that's a good point. Now, yes, the RSS is the power behind the throne. And in this past week, I've spoken with representatives from a number of different Indian American diaspora organizations who have all denounced this visit. Most of them called for the resignation or removal of Ambassador Keshup. And however, some of them have acknowledged and pointed out that they do not fault the US for meeting with the RSS. As you mentioned, as I've said, it is the power behind the throne, and it makes sense in some kind of way. However, the nature of the meeting is particularly troublesome. This was a public meeting. It was essentially a photo op. It was reported on by the ambassador as a good discussion with the RSS chief about the values of diversity, inclusivity, pluralism, and democracy, all of which are values and principles which the RSS stands in ideology and in practice diametrically opposed to. So it makes sense with the nature of geopolitics today, with the nature of the US-India relationship, with the nature of the world, that the US would want to have some kind of communication and contact with the RSS, just as with the Taliban, or if it was possible, even with ISIS, I would say, or with North Korea, or with any other country, any other terrorist group even in the world. However, the way in which this was done, where it came across as a photo op, it was public, it platformed and promoted this fascist, and many call it terrorist organization, and appeared to legitimize, normalize, and whitewash them. That's what's deeply concerning. I would, particularly as an American, but also as somebody who's an expert on this topic, and also in listening to the concerns and the opinions of Indian American diaspora representatives, I would argue that what should have been done, and what I even would hope would be happening, is that the US should be in touch with the RSS behind the scenes. This public meeting essentially glorified the RSS instead of simply doing what I would hope my country would be doing, which is staying in touch with them, keeping an open back channel.
The USEF, United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, which is sort of a, congressionally established body, they have been recommending that India should be, declared a country of particular concern, and there should be sanctions on India. And of course, this has been ignored by the Trump administration, now Biden administration. But during the Trump administration, no American ambassador, although he was a political appointee, is known to have met RSS chief, which, as you say, public meeting is sort of a endorsement or acceptance and encouragement altogether. Do you think Biden administration is willing to ignore each and everything in competition with China?
Well, that's an interesting question. And as you mentioned, under the Trump administration, the Trump administration was bad enough, certainly vis-a-vis the relationship with the Modi regime. Trump was notoriously intimate friends with Modi. Trump platformed and promoted Modi at the Howdy Modi event in Houston, Texas in 2019. He participated in an event in India, in Gujarat, where Modi was platforming and promoting Trump. They had this nefariously symbiotic relationship. But the Biden administration took things a step further, and they platformed and promoted the RSS itself. And so under the Biden administration, it's very concerning. I would say we have to be careful about being lazy and complacent and thinking that simply because Trump is out of office and Biden is in, that we will somehow see a magically altered relationship between the US and India under the Modi regime. The same people are in the bureaucracies. The same people are behind the scenes in the civil service. I have a feeling that many of them are directing US foreign policy. Now, you bring up China, and it's important to remember that India is not the only country in the world, certainly, which has a troubling human rights situation, which has stripped away civil liberties. China is a perfect example of that. It is one of the most authoritarian, tyrannical countries in the world. One of the major differences, however, is that in the case of China, there is no pretense of it being a democracy. We know that China doesn't have on paper any protection for human rights and civil liberties for its citizens. We don't expect it to. So the way in which we develop and engage with, develop our relationship and engage with China is with our eyes wide open and full awareness of that. Similar situation with Russia. We know Russia is an authoritarian nation, which is a de facto dictatorship. The whole world knows that. However, in the case of India, most people, particularly in my country, the United States, seem to have their blinders on and seem to be very distracted by the fact that India is, in name, a democracy, in practice, a democracy. However, it is at this point a failed democracy, which has developed into an authoritarian nation. It's on the path to a situation for its citizens, which would be comparable to that in China. It's certainly, I would say, it's already on level with Russia, if not surpassed that. And the problem with India is that people are so distracted by the fact that India is a democracy that they overlook what's actually happening on the streets in reality, in practice.
And as you talk of these streets, it's an everyday thing which nobody seems to care. Just this morning, I started hearing about Harsh Mandar, a human rights activist who, because of Modi's massacre, left the Indian administrative services and have become a human rights activist. His offices, his home, everything is raided and nobody seems to care.
Yeah.
But how does on the street RSS operates? Because when Trump was visiting in Delhi, a dude named Kapil Mishra, who is a little politician in the city, is videographed giving ultimatum to police officer who is standing next to him. If you're not going to take care of the protesters, we will take care of them. And he did. 53 people died. But Yusuf and everybody asked for the sanctions on India, but people like Kapil Mishra survived. So how do they operate? How do we know that Kapil Mishra is a member of RSS? Is RSS guiding, or they have become a movement in which different actors act on their own?
Well, certainly, as you mentioned, Kapil Mishra, a member of the BJP, I believe he's a state-level politician in Delhi. He was there. He was delivering this fiery, radical, inflammatory speech, essentially calling for violence on the streets against protesters who were protesting CAA and NRC. and that turned into a pogrom in Delhi in February 2020. And in that pogrom, we saw a repeat. We saw mirrored the same pattern that we saw in 2002 Gujarat pogrom under Modi when he was the chief minister of that state. We saw the police joining hands with the mob. And in the case of Delhi, police were even accused in many cases of going door to door, smashing down doors and pulling out victims from inside the houses, handing them over to the mob to be beaten or killed. In the case of Gujarat 2002, we saw police similarly participating, and we have to remember that the RSS has been in existence since 1925, and it's been for decades now. The people who have been reporting on, documenting the activities of the RSS have been warning us that the RSS has had a decades-long project to infiltrate the ranks of all levels of society, particularly bureaucracies, civil service, the police. That began in Gujarat. The RSS infiltrated the police and stacked the ranks of the police with RSS members. Now, as far as how the RSS operates on the streets, in 2002, they were accused, the mob was accused of being in possession of such things as lists of voters, which helped them to identify the homes of minority-owned or Muslim-owned homes and businesses, and specifically go after them and target them. How did they get a hold of these? They got a hold of them through complicity of the government, the BJP-ruled government. The RSS works hand in hand with the BJP, and they have a symbiotic relationship where they assist each other. In the case of Kapil Mishra, now I don't believe, from all of my research, he himself is not actually a member of the RSS, but we have to look back at this pattern before Kapil Mishra, in January 2020, there was Cabinet Minister Anurag Thakur. He was also in the streets. He was also speaking to a mob of people. He was calling for people to shoot the traitors, in his words. There was this pattern where these BJP members from various levels of government were on the streets. They were urging people to engage in violence and to go and basically conduct a pogrom. This pogrom, those implicated in the actual violence are RSS members or members of RSS affiliated groups.
So tell me, Peter, I mean, comparing with China and India, do you think RSS is essentially acting as Communist Party in China would?
Well, I suppose it depends on how you mean that, but the RSS and the BJP appears to be well along the path towards establishing India as a one-party state, which certainly is the case under the CCP. The RSS-BJP regime is repeatedly targeting its critics. It's going after anybody who offers any kind of opposition, any noted or famous activists or academics, people such as Harsh Mander, who stand up and call out the BJP RSS and its radical Hindu nationalist agenda. It is, as far as the situation goes in relation to the protection of human rights, the protection of civil liberties, the right to freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom to publish, freedom to dissent, freedom to demand redress for grievances from the government, freedom of religion, freedom to be free from unreasonable search and seizure, all of these basic civil liberties that we value in the free nations of the world. It is on track to strip those away completely. It's already pretty much gotten to that point. So yes, I would compare the situation under the RSS-BJP as on the same path towards what we see under the CCP.
Well, thank you so much, Peter, for your time. Truly appreciate your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Malik.
Back to you, Samana.
Thank you, Imam Mujahid. That's all from our Chicago studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Salam and good night.